Hey, and welcome to Finlos Teaches. I'm going to share 3 awesome experiences that I had with my students this week while teaching the story Everything That Rises Must Converge by Flannery O'Connor. This is one of my favorite short stories to teach because it has so many layers and so many different themes that students can latch onto and explore while they're practicing their tools for analysis and making connections between the different concepts that they're learning in my class and their other classes. The story is about a recent college graduate who begrudgingly has to escort his mother to her, quote, reduction class at the Y. Obviously, this is a class designed to help her lose weight, and we are given the foreshadowing element that she has high blood pressure. Right away, the author gives us a few key elements that we need to hold on to as we continue to read. We are in the South. We are in the early to mid 1960s. The mother is latching on to antiquated ideas about race and class, while the son, Julian, has more progressive ideas that he's gained from his recent experiences at a liberal arts college. A key element of this story is the symbol of a hat that the mother obsesses over in the beginning of the story. It's a hat that she frets about having to have spent $7 to purchase and waffles back and forth about whether or not she should wear it out or if she should return it. And Julian, annoyed, doesn't really care one way or another and simply sees this as another reason to loathe the presence of his mother and everything that she represents to him about their racist past. The bulk of the story takes place on a bus as they ride to the YMCA for her class. And as they ride on the bus, several interesting qualities of the two characters are revealed. Julian, who has shown himself already to be quite petulant and himself obnoxious, reveals his own internalized racism as he fantasizes about dating an African-American girl simply to annoy his mother and to make her uncomfortable. And to further this discomfort, he purposefully sits beside a black man who's trying to mind his own business, simply, again, for the pleasure of annoying his mom and making her uncomfortable. And the story culminates with the mother coming face to face with her equal opposite, a black woman wearing very similar clothing with her son and wearing the exact same hat. The story continues from there, and I won't reveal too much about the ending because it really is a story worth reading if it's one you're unfamiliar with. But it's the conversation that took place after that I really want to focus on. I don't do much front-loading when I teach texts like this, and by that I mean I don't give a lot of biographical information about the author or necessarily historical context beyond what is absolutely necessary to understand the concepts or the plot elements that are taking place within the narrative. So in this case, what I let the students know was that it was a work of fiction that was written by a woman in the early 1960s. Specifically, this story was published in 1962, I believe. And beyond that, I didn't really give them that much information. If they have questions about diction or references that they're not sure of, I'll clarify, but I really try my best to set up a situation where they're able to bring their own prior knowledge and their own contextual information to bear so that way they can have a true and honest response to the story before we go into the historical context or the biographical information that really is essential to doing a complete and thorough analysis. So in this case, we read the story and we were discussing the key elements, and I revealed to the students a little bit of information about Flannery O'Connor, that she was obviously, like I said, a woman who was writing primarily in the late 50s and early 60s in the South in the United States. And the students were picking up on sort of the progressive elements of this story, the considerations about how Julian's mother definitely is clinging to this antebellum Southern past, whereas Julian is ashamed and constantly trying to drag his mother into the present or even the future in terms of race relations in the United States, all the while being unaware of his own biases that he carries with him and his own acts of racism and his own racist thoughts and behaviors, and the irony that that presents to the reader, and the challenges that it gives to the reader to constantly question our own thoughts and motives when we're interacting with people. And so one of my students, and this is a student who generally doesn't say a lot, they're quiet, but they always sit in the front row and they're always listening. And the student raised his hand and said, "I wonder if the author did this intentionally, as you're describing, or if maybe the author had her own racism that she was portraying in this character without even realizing it." And this is coming because I had mentioned that even though we're reading some progressive ideals in this story, it came out after her death that Flannery O'Connor, through letters and journals, had espoused some problematic viewpoints on African Americans herself. And so this student was really trying to navigate those relationships between the characters and the author, and whether or not we can separate ourselves from the characters that we create as writers. And it was just a really refreshing take, a really, without having been instructed in the language of like deconstructivist analysis, it was just a really nuanced take on the reading, and a very astute question to ask and to consider. Another conversation that came up was, as the mother has to face her equal opposite character in the African American woman who gets on the bus, I was introducing the concepts of schema, because a lot of my students take psychology, and I studied psychology in college as well. And a lot of this credit actually has to go to my partner, Eva, who is a therapist and social worker who has helped me develop a lot of these processes of education in class and making sure to kind of connect these dots between these areas of study. And so we're talking about schemas and how when we challenge those schemas, or when those schemas are challenged through our daily lives, we experience dissonance, which is very much what the mother experiences as she sees this Black woman wearing the exact same hat that she is. And while some of us are able to adapt and adjust our schemas to account for this new information, the mother isn't. And because of that, the dissonance manifests itself physically and biologically. And again, I won't give too many of the details for the story, but it makes for a very interesting ending. And something very similar happens to the character of Julian when he witnesses this sort of psychic downfall of his mother. He encounters his own challenge to his schemas of who he thinks he is as a well-educated man, and suddenly is faced with the reality that he is very much alone and very much does not know what to do. And so I was able to tie these concepts of schemas back to the Pixar film Inside Out, if I'm remembering the name of the movie correctly, where this is the one about Riley who they moved to San Francisco and her core memories are lost. And this is the same idea of schemas and how we lose our identities if our schemas are challenged or damaged or broken through experience. And so thanks to that conversation, a lot of the students were able to make the connections between how our psychological experiences can impact how we relate and how we behave in real life. And so that was a very helpful conversation to be able to have. And finally, I was asked a very interesting, and for the student it was very uncomfortable, but for me it was very refreshing, given the topic of the story dealing with racism in the South, and given that there are many laws currently being brought before state governments about regulating what teachers can and cannot teach in class. The student asked me how I feel about the potential passing of laws which would not allow me to teach this specific story or stories like it in the same way in the future. And it was a really nice moment for me to have to pause and consider my response, because I take my political neutrality in the classroom very seriously, and it's something that I address every year with my students about making sure that I don't let my own personal biases and my own political ideas cross over too much into the instruction. I mean, of course, there's bias in everything that we do, from the texts that we choose to teach to the way that we teach them and the way that we communicate. But I am very conscious of those things, and I try to limit it as much as possible. But I felt that this was a moment for me to actually have a frank conversation about the value and the importance of the independence of teachers to be able to fully address the history of not just our culture and our country, but of the events that have happened in the past that we have concrete and specific evidence about. And so I told the student that I'm absolutely not going to stop teaching this story, whether or not they pass a law that would prohibit me from addressing concepts like racism, because I think that it's a dangerous path to cut, where we start disallowing the truth to be spoken. And so I think that in that conversation, a lot of students got to hear a very nuanced, not just from me, but from the student who was asking the question and other students who gave their thoughts as well, a very nuanced and a very honest conversation about the relationship between politics and education and fiction and storytelling, and the value that all of those things have, and the importance of honesty in the classroom, historical honesty, interpretive honesty, and acknowledging a shared history that is not always pretty. Now, of course, I carry a certain amount of privilege in this conversation that I have to acknowledge. I am a male-presenting person. I am white passing for all intents and purposes. And significant to this conversation, I have tenure. I have job permanence, which is a very rare thing, a very rare bit of security in not just this profession, but in professional lives in general. And that is an incredibly powerful bit of armor that I possess. And I acknowledge that to the students as well, that I can take this risk with the understanding that it would be a relatively safe risk to take on my part, because the tenure that I possess in this district grants me certain privileges and protections that a lot of teachers who entered this profession later than I did don't have. They don't have job security in the sense that they can not be hired next year because they don't have a guaranteed contract like I do. And so I have to recognize that and just point it out, because it's an important thing to understand about the changing profession of education and of teaching. So those are just some highlights from my week of teaching. The story that I was referring to once again is called Everything That Rises Must Converge by Flannery O'Connor. If you have any questions or comments that you'd like to share with me about the teaching profession, about this story, or about any of the experiences that I shared today, please contact me via social media. I hope you'll join me next time.